Hey, everybody. It is Monday, June 10th. You're listening to the mo.news podcast. I'm mo.news.
And I'm Jill Wagner. This is the place where we bring you just the facts.
And we read all the news and read between the lines so you don't have to. Jill, thanks for holding on the fort for a couple days last week. Much needed break.
My pleasure, Moshe, but it is good to have you back.
For those who didn't get to the end of the podcast on Friday, we had a special treat. Your daughter giving her picks for what she's reading, eating, and watching this weekend. Jill, I wonder if we're going to make this a permanent feature.
Moshe, I got a ton of feedback from people who absolutely loved it. And I had mentioned it to my daughter earlier in the day, just saying, oh, Moshe is out. So, maybe you'll come on for our final segment. I kind of thought she would forget and I was just going to do it myself. And then I heard her kind of like outside of my door while I was recording the podcast, waiting to come in. So I said, all right, I guess she wants to do it.
She's in.
And she was in, and we didn't go over any of her answers. And I thought she nailed it. And so did the crowd.
Ad-libbing really important in this medium, so she might be taken after her mother here.
It was just funny, though, to go from what you're watching, which was like a Hitler documentary. I was watching something called The Hitman, and she's like Daniel Tiger and Gabby's Dollhouse. Pretty much on point, right?
I'd be more concerned if she was watching what we're watching. So yeah. that works.
All right. Well, I did appreciate everyone who messaged me that they thought it was a cute way to end the podcast on Friday. But again, Moshe, I'm thrilled to have you back. And let's just get to the news because there is a ton of it. Let's start with the headlines here. We go inside the Israeli hostage rescue operation and what it means now for the 8-month war moving forward. A stunning snub, Caitlin Clark left off of the U.S. women's Olympic basketball team. The results of the vote across 27 countries in Europe are in, and it appears Europeans are moving towards the right on major issues for the next parliament. We'll explain what that means. The FDA set to announce new nutrition labels for the front of the packaging, how the industry is reacting.
Not well, Jill. Not well.
A new study out with concerns about the sugar substitute Xylitol. We lose an icon from the Apollo space mission. Plus, Pat Sajak saying goodbye to Wheel of Fortune after 43 years. And Moshe is on this day in history.
Jill, was this the day that Benjamin Franklin flew a kite with a key at the end or not? We'll try to get to the bottom of it.
Based on that, I'm going to go, yes, it is. But I guess there's more to the story.
It's the 1700s, Jill. Dates are a little murky that summer.
All right, our top story: 4 Israeli hostages were rescued alive by troops in a major mission Saturday to free them from Hamas captivity in the central Gaza Strip. Israeli special forces simultaneously raided 2 Hamas sites about 2 blocks apart in the central Gaza town of Al-Nusrat, where the hostages were being held. That is a heavily residential area within a humanitarian zone within tens of thousands of civilians. The 4 hostages are 25-year-old Noah Argamani, 21-year-old Almog Meir John, 27-year-old Andrei Kozlov, and 40-year-old Shlomi Ziv. All 4 had been abducted by Hamas terrorists on October 7th from the Nova Music Festival. Israeli forces said that they came under heavy fire, including rocket-propelled grenades, during the raid, and believe that around 100 Palestinians were killed during the operation. The Hamas-led Gaza Health Ministry put the total at 274 dead, including a number of children, with hundreds more wounded. Local officials describe overwhelmed hospitals, and some media in the Arab world are calling it a massacre. We should note Hamas casualty numbers do not distinguish between civilians and combatants, nor whether they were killed by Israeli or Hamas gunfire. U.S. authorities say they aren't sure we'll really ever get to a firm number. And the added issue here, it appears that Palestinian civilians were among those that were holding these hostages in their apartments. At one location, Noah Argamani was being held in an apartment of a journalist, his wife, and his father, who is a doctor. All 3 were killed in the operation. Hamas will often pay families to keep hostages and house armed Hamas militants. Argamani had been one of the most widely recognized hostages after being taken, like the three others from that music festival. The video of her abduction showed her seated between two men on a motorcycle as she screamed, "Don't kill me." And that photo was on front pages of newspapers. The other three hostages who were also taken from the Nova Music Festival, they were found at the second location. They were being held about 200 meters away in a residential building in the heart of a civilian neighborhood. This is an area of the Gaza Strip that the Israelis haven't really invaded. The rescued hostages were all found in good condition, even as they came under heavy Hamas fire during the rescue. They were reunited with their families at hospitals in Israel on Saturday. One Israeli commando died after being hit by gunfire from Hamas terrorists during the raid. Earlier this year, the mother of Argamani, Leora, pleaded with world leaders to help bring her daughter home. She herself is Chinese, and she was asking not only for the Israeli government and the American government to get involved, but also for the Chinese government to get involved. It appears, unless there's something we don't know, that they did not get involved at all. Her appeal to see her daughter came as she is nearing death with stage 4 brain cancer. Noah was reunited with her mother and her father this weekend. Even though Leora is in very serious condition, doctors do believe that she was conscious enough to know that Noah was free.
Jill, a lot of headlines crossing on this over the weekend. We were covering it all weekend long over on the mo.news premium Instagram account, where we were trying to track the details as they were coming in. There's a U.S. angle to this. The U.S. provided intelligence that supported the Israeli operation here, but did not provide military assistance, despite some of the allegations by Hamas that came under scrutiny over the weekend because the Israelis positioned helicopters right next to that humanitarian pier in Gaza that we've been talking about, the American pier. The Israelis had helicopters stationed there that eventually ferried out the 4 freed, rescued hostages from that area of the beach. The Israelis planned this for weeks. They actually created mock buildings, mock apartments with the intelligence they had, working with multiple Israeli units, multiple teams to ensure they could conduct this operation. And many times the Israelis will conduct operations overnight. That's oftentimes when special forces will do these raids. They thought to throw off Hamas, they were going to do this in the middle of the day. So they did this at about 11 a.m. on Saturday, full daylight. The U.S. is among the countries from the beginning that has been trying to provide intel to the Israelis. Remember, there's more than a dozen countries, hostages are still being held in Gaza. That includes 8 Americans, 3 are dead, 5 are alive. None were among those 4 rescued this weekend. Hamas, in its response, said the following, quote, "The enemy continues to massacre our people, children, and women, the likes of which is taking place in Nuseirat. If the occupation believes it can impose its choices on us by force, then it is delusional. The movement will not agree to any agreement that does not achieve security for our people first." There were various Hamas officials over the weekend saying that this could make a ceasefire agreement more complicated, very upset about this. Remember, the way the hostage exchange would work via previous ceasefires is Hamas has been asking for multiple Palestinian prisoners in exchange for every Israeli hostage. We've seen numbers anywhere from 30 to 50 to 100 Palestinian prisoners for every Israeli hostage. So they see this, Hamas sees these hostages as huge leverage for them. As far as they're concerned, a huge disappointment for them this weekend with this Israeli rescue operation.
Presumably, we're all, at least at one point, part of the IDF.
Right. Hamas has only been agreeing to release the elderly, women, children. They were going to ask a lot for every male Israeli. So the fact that the Israelis were able to rescue 3 men here, these men might not have seen home anytime soon, depending on how these negotiations go. Also getting a lot of attention, Jill, you mentioned Argamani was being held in a private home that included the home of 36-year-old journalist Abdullah Al-Jamal. Al-Jamal is identified as a staff writer for a U.S. outlet called the Palestine Chronicle. It's actually a 501c3 here. He was a reporter for them. He'd also done some work in the past for Al Jazeera. You noted his father was a doctor, his wife also present. All 3 were killed. Notably, Al Jazeera trying to distance themselves from Al-Jamal, saying he'd only done freelance work or part-time work for them in the past. He was not a full-time employee of Al Jazeera, Arabic or English. Now, across the region, the Israelis getting condemnation from the Egyptians, from the Jordanians, condemning the rescue operation. The U.S. and some Western allies congratulating the Israelis, everyone really reinforcing that ultimately here, this will all end with a ceasefire deal to bring home the hostages and end the war. No, it was notable because the U.S. over the weekend made the point that it's on Hamas right now to agree to the ceasefire deal. The Israelis, they believe, have done everything they can and have offered a very good deal to Hamas. But at the same time, even within Israel, you're still seeing continuing debate. There was a lot of celebration across Israel on Saturday. Much needed good news for the country as they learned of the 4 hostages being rescued. At the same time, you saw tens of thousands of Israelis hit the streets Saturday night, calling on the government to do what it takes, sign a ceasefire deal to bring the remaining hostages home. They're believed to be about 120 hostages remaining now, about 80 to 90 of them still alive.
And for the Israelis, one of the reasons for the urgency for a deal is that many will admit, these 4 hostages that were rescued were above ground. But so many of them are in these tunnels below ground that makes it virtually impossible for the military to rescue them. For anybody who's questioning why don't we see more of this, the belief is that a lot of these hostages are in tunnels deep underground.
Yeah, keep in mind that if you look at this 8-month war so far, 105 of the hostages came home through those deals in November. 7 have come home via rescue operations, 3 different rescue operations. So just to give you a sense of how complex these operations are. And obviously, we've discussed the aftermath here. At least 100, upwards of 200 Palestinians are dead in the aftermath of that operation. So incredibly complex, took months, took weeks of planning here. That said, a lot of focus will be back on the Israeli government this week. That comes as Benny Gantz, a centrist member of the war cabinet, resigned last night. They've had effectively since the beginning of the war, a 3-member cabinet making decisions here alongside Benjamin Netanyahu. Gantz, a popular former military chief, also a rival of Netanyahu, came into the government as Israelis felt they had to come together after October 7th. He has grown increasingly frustrated with Netanyahu and his leadership. And so in his speech last night, he says the people of Israel deserve more than empty promises. True victory means the return of the hostages, the replacement of Hamas, a ceasefire deal, a long-term plan for what happens in Gaza. He believes that, in his speech, Netanyahu is preventing Israelis from reaching true victory. He's calling for immediate elections this fall. Keep in mind, right now, his departure doesn't end the Netanyahu government. He still has a majority in the parliament, so he can remain as prime minister. But elections aren't set until the fall of 2026. A lot of Israelis, including Gantz, saying they should happen sooner.
All right, switching gears, just over a month from the start of the Summer Olympic Games, and one snub is getting a whole lot of attention. The brightest rising star in women's basketball will not be getting the chance to take center stage in Paris this summer. U.S. basketball has decided not to include Caitlin Clark on its 12-player roster for the women's competition in Paris. She has emerged as the face of her sport since leading the University of Iowa to back-to-back national championship games and being selected as the number 1 pick in this year's WNBA draft. But she was snubbed from a veteran-dominated roster that's seeking USA Basketball's 8th straight gold medal. Reporter Christine Brennan of USA Today said the decision makers at Team USA were apparently concerned about how Clark's millions of fans would react to what would likely be limited playing time. She reports that it appears to be what she calls an extraordinary admission of the tension that this multi-million-dollar sensation, Caitlin Clark, who signs autographs for dozens of children before and after every game, has caused for the old guard of women's basketball. U.S. women's Olympic basketball team is the most dominant team in the world, having last lost a game in 1992. Even at the women's gold medal basketball games at the Olympics, the press stand, though, but even at those games at the Olympics, the press stand is always almost half empty, if not worse, according to Brennan.
Yeah, we used to have Brennan on all the time over on CBS News. She is very well sourced in this world. And effectively what she's hearing, the translation is, the older players don't want Clark around. They're jealous of her attention, and they wanted the Olympics to themselves this time. And it's not like the U.S. has much competition. As you noted, they've been winning basically everything since the early 90s. And you do have some players on the team that are now making their 4th and 5th appearances in the Olympics. As for Clark, though, her response, very civil. She tells the publication The Athletic, "I'm excited for the girls who are on the team. I know it's the most competitive team in the world, and I know it could have gone either way, me being on the team, me not being on the team. So I'm excited for them. I'm rooting for them to win the gold. I was a kid that grew up watching the Olympics. No disappointment. I think it just gives you something to work for. That's a dream. Hopefully one day I can be there. I think it's just a little motivation. You remember that. And hopefully in 4 years, I can be there.
Certainly a classy response there, Moshe.
Yeah, she says she's going to wait her turn. At the same time, there's a lot of people who are much more critical of this decision, saying that she would have ignited interest not just within the U.S., but around the world. I can imagine, Jill, as I saw the headline on Saturday, the amount of sighs happening at NBC, who were very much hoping to have Caitlin Clark as one of the main attractions to get people to watch all of the games, to ride the momentum that we've been seeing, we've been seeing, tons of girls and boys, women and men be inspired by her performance. Jill, just late last week, Friday night, they had the largest WNBA crowd in 17 years in D.C. as Caitlin Clark of the Indiana Fever was facing off against the D.C. Mystics. The two teams combined a 2-19 record, but they sold out. Stands were packed. Hundreds of children, adults in the crowd showing up early to get autographs, wearing her jersey. So the critics out there are saying, like, Team USA, how could you give up on this? This would have been a huge thing for you guys this summer. Even chiming in, 4-time Olympic gold medalist Lisa Leslie, you might remember her, one of the greatest women's players of all time. She said recently, I don't know how you leave the country without her. She should 100% be on Team USA.
I don't really follow the women's basketball or the men's basketball that closely, so I can't really.
Jill doesn't follow the basketball.
Only during March Madness. But so I can't really opine on where Caitlin Clark stands in comparison to the other Olympic athletes. All I'll say is this. If she deserved to be on the team from just an athletic perspective and just an ability, and if her basketball ability meant that she deserved a spot, then she should get one. So my opinion on it is she shouldn't get the spot over somebody else because she would bring attention, but she shouldn't not get the spot because it might rub some of the other players the wrong way.
Well, it sounds like it's a little bit of everything on this one. Jill, some people comparing it to the 1992 Dream Team. If you remember that team, the men's team, Michael Jordan, Charles Barkley, Magic Johnson. Also playing on that team, a young Christian Laettner of Duke University. So, if Christian Laettner can make the Dream Team, Caitlin Clark should have been on this team.
Time for the speed read from Reuters. Elections in 27 countries for the European Parliament ended on Sunday with early projections giving far-right parties a strong showing. The far right was seen scoring big gains in Germany and France, joining the Netherlands and offering the first signs of an expected rightwards shift. It shows strong voter dissatisfaction across Europe for the establishment and mainstream. That's been happening across a number of countries across the continent for a while. It means the European Parliament moving forward is likely to slow down on some of their policies to address climate change and be more eager to support measures to limit immigration to the EU. The Parliament could also be more fragmented, which would make adopting any measure trickier and slower as the EU confronts challenges, including a hostile Russia and increased industrial rivalry from China and the United States.
And when we talk about European right and move to the right, Jill, it's not like the U.S. right. They're still pretty moderate by U.S. standards, much more Mitt Romney to the left of Mitt Romney than Marjorie Taylor Greene, as we talk about rightward shift in Europe. Still, it's notable here. And just for some background, all the countries in Europe, they still operate as their own countries, but as members of the European Union, they're part of the European Parliament. So what does the European Parliament do? Well, it votes on legislation that's key for all the 27 countries, larger policies, regulatory policies. We often talk about how Europe is cracking down on AI or tech companies, etc. That's handled on a Europe-wide level. They have ultimate approval over billions of euros allocated in the EU budget, deal with larger immigration initiatives, policies towards Ukraine, etc., that all the European countries feel like they need to work on together. Notably, Jill, the results were so stark in France, it led late Sunday night the French President Macron to call for a snap election in France, which will happen in just a few weeks, as his party was trounced by the far-right opposition in France. So those elections taking place at the end of the month, they'll determine the future of the French legislature, more than 500 members there, but they hold presidential elections separately in France. So Macron stays in power through 2027. But the parliament could change hands here, could make life much more difficult for him. So he decided to make this call based on what he saw was happening among French voters. And it comes as you're seeing this moment here across France, where while some leaders are looking for closer cooperation, integration, you have a lot of individuals, people in the actual countries, in Germany, in France, in Italy, etc., who are wary of what they feel is European overreach, much more into the rights of their countries. You saw it go so far more than a decade ago, wherein the UK voted for Brexit to leave the EU. No signs of that anytime close here, that there's been some talk of that in Italy and France, but nothing like we saw in Britain. But still, major concerns about the amount of immigration that's come in from Africa and the Middle East in recent years, and these individual countries handing over too many rights, the belief is, to the European-wide system.
From the Washington Post, the FDA is expected to soon propose a change to pre-packaged food sold in America that includes a requirement that the front of the packages display key nutrient information. This would be in addition to the nutrition label that's already on the back. The concept is designed to quickly convey health ramifications to busy consumers about the food and beverages that they're considering buying. And while new in the U.S., this is not new abroad. Worldwide, dozens of countries already have front of package nutrition labels that come in various designs. In Chile, a stop sign symbol on the front of an item indicates if it has high sugar, saturated fat, sodium, or calories. In Israel, there is a red warning label on those types of food and drinks. Advocates have been asking the FDA for nearly 2 decades to require front of pack labels, which they say help people make healthier choices and prod food manufacturers to reformulate their recipes so they have fewer warnings on their products.
Well, the industry ain't too happy about it, Jill. Looks like it's going to go to court here if the FDA announces it. The idea faces opposition from trade associations representing America's big food and beverage makers. They've created their own voluntary system for highlighting certain nutrients over a decade ago, and they say that they're going to challenge these new FDA guidelines on First Amendment grounds. So an interesting legal fight here that ultimately, like many things we tell you on this podcast, may take years to figure itself out. According to U.S. law, the U.S. does interpret free speech much broader and more inclusive of corporate speech than in any other country in the world. So that's some of the obstacles here the FDA faces. Designs that are purely factual, stating the number of grams, added sugars, etc., are more likely to be considered constitutional here than designs like the stop sign you mentioned in some countries, where shapes or colors to indicate that a food is unhealthy, that might be deemed by the courts here to be bridged too far, and that you can only just put the front of label, sugar, and saturated fat and that type of information on the front. So we'll wait here the FDA announcement, Jill, and then the subsequent lawsuit, court cases, and appeals.
From the Associated Press, William Anders, an astronaut who was one of the first 3 people to orbit the moon and who took the famous Earthrise photo, died on Friday after a small plane that he was in crashed in the water north of Seattle. He was 90 years old. The Coast Guard confirmed it was a plane crash between Orcas and Jones Islands, which are about 80 miles north of Seattle. The sheriff's office said only the pilot was believed to have been in the 2-seat plane. A body was recovered and the pilot's identification retrieved. Anders, Frank Borman, and Jim Lovell were part of the Apollo 8 mission, the first group of spacemen to leave the bounds of Earth's orbit.
Yeah, you had those various Apollo missions. Apollo 8 significant because this is the first one that went around the moon. And they took pictures. Anders took pictures as they were making their way around the moon to help prep for what would be the Apollo 11 flight when the first astronauts land on the moon. And during those orbits around the moon is when he took his famous Earthrise photo. Jill, to describe it to you, basically, it's the lunar surface, and you see Earth rising above the moon, just the dark black of space behind it. Iconic photo. I imagine all of you have seen a number of times, and it's actually credited with inspiring the modern environmental movement, showing how delicate, how isolated Earth is in space. So we just wanted to make note of that, Jill, as we remember William Anders.
From NBC News, a sweetener called Xylitol that is commonly used in sugar-free drinks, chewing gum, and toothpaste has been linked to a higher risk of heart attacks and strokes. Researchers led by the Cleveland Clinic found links according to a study published last week in the European Heart Journal. Xylitol is a sugar alcohol that is found in small amounts in fruit and vegetables, and the human body also produces it as an additive. It looks and tastes like sugar, but has 40% fewer calories. It's used at much higher concentrations than found in nature in sugar-free gum, candies, toothpaste, and baked goods. Researchers from the Cleveland Clinic conducted several studies. In one, they analyzed saved plasma samples of participants of an earlier study, more than 3,000 subjects who had been fasting. These subjects had been followed over 3 years, during which some of them had suffered a cardiovascular event like a heart attack or stroke. In the new study, researchers found that those who had suffered a cardiovascular event had high blood levels of xylitol.
Yeah, so researchers also studied xylitol's effect on clotting using human whole blood and platelets, and found that xylitol caused platelets in the blood to clot. Now, at the same time, the researchers caution that these studies show that while xylitol is linked with a higher risk of events, they do not show causation. Remember, we all learned this in science class. Correlation is not causation. So they do believe there needs to be more studies here, that they found this link, but they want to see whether there's any cause here, investigating sugar alcohols, artificial sweeteners, etc. Researchers at the Cleveland Clinic cautioning not to throw out your toothpaste if it has xylitol in it, but that we should be aware that consumption of a product containing high levels of it could lead to blood clotting events.
And finally, from ABC News, a TV icon said goodbye Friday. After 43 years at Wheel of Fortune, Pat Sajak bid farewell late last week, saying that he wants everyone to know how lucky he feels to have hosted Wheel of Fortune since 1981. Sajak's final episode aired on June 7th, and he shared some words for all of the fans and viewers who have tuned in over the years in a goodbye message. So take a listen.
The time has come to say goodbye. I have a few thanks and acknowledgments before I go, and I want to start with all of you watching out there. It's been an incredible privilege to be invited into millions of homes, night after night, year after year, decade after decade. And I've always felt that the privilege came with a responsibility to keep this daily half hour a safe place for family fun. No social issues, no politics, nothing embarrassing, I hope, just a game.
Sajak also opened up about how the program evolved into a show that did serve a greater purpose, a way for people to learn English and kids to learn their letters and how to read.
Yeah, so Sajak says he's 77 and wants to enjoy the years he has left without the grind of the job. He first hosted, as you mentioned, in 1981. He's taped more than 8,000 episodes, most of those alongside Vanna White. Vanna apparently was not interested in taking over the full-time hosting duties, but she did renew her contract to continue churning the letters for at least a couple more seasons, I believe through 2026 now. As for Sajak's replacement, apparently Ryan Seacrest has time between all of his other jobs. So Ryan Seacrest will be the new host of Wheel of Fortune in September. Again, Jill, I don't know how Seacrest does it.
Moshe, I thought you had a lot on your plate, and I thought I had a lot on my plate, but Ryan Seacrest absolutely takes the cake. Back to what Pat Sajak said. I love that he talked about just kind of keeping Wheel of Fortune as that 30 minutes of just good old-fashioned fun, and you could just enjoy it with your family. And he also said that he would rather leave maybe a couple of years too early than stay on too late and kind of like stay on too long, where people are like, all right, this guy doesn't have it anymore. It's time for him to go. And I think as we talk about the age of presidential candidates and politicians and Supreme Court justices, I think it's just fascinating to see that contrast.
Yeah, apparently in Hollywood, you know when to hang it up. In Washington, you do not. We should note Sajak younger than both Donald Trump and Joe Biden. All right, now time for On This Day in History. On this day in 1752, we think Benjamin Franklin flew a kite during a thunderstorm. They think it happened at some point during that summer. Between the letters, historians have said, we think it happened on June 10th. So here at Mo.news, we're going with June 10th. Now, there's a lot of myths around this, right? That he was trying to discover the existence of electricity. Well, electricity had already been discovered years previous. So he was trying to effectively try to bottle it up in some way. There's also the myth that he was struck by lightning while flying the kite with the key. Historians say That's unlikely because he would have died if that had happened. So all we know is Benjamin Franklin at some point says he flew a kite with a key. We think it happened this day. As far as the rest is concerned, I'll leave it to the historians to try to dive into that. All right, on this day in 1933, President Franklin Roosevelt issued the executive order making Mount Rushmore part of the National Park Service. Obviously, to this day, Mount Rushmore continues to be a controversial monument with a number of native tribes saying that that is part of a holy native land that was taken from them by the U.S. government. On this day in 1977, the Apple II personal computer was introduced, still one of those very large computers. Jello version of that is what we grew up playing Oregon Trail and Number Munchers on. And on this day in 1980 in South Africa, Nelson Mandela published his first major statement from prison. The message had actually been written in response to the 1976 Soweto uprising. It had been smuggled out of his prison years earlier. It ends with a rallying cry, unite, mobilize, fight on, part of the effort to crush apartheid. Within a decade, he would do so and be released from prison. And we end here with a couple pop culture items, as we typically do. On this day 30 years ago, Speed, starring Keanu Reeves, Sandra Bullock, Dennis Hopper, premiered in theaters. Pop quiz, hotshot. Haven't seen that one in a while.
That's right. Dennis Hopper calling the Sandra Bullock character Wildcat, and that's how they figured it all out, that he was connected to the camera on the bus.
Jill, I think we continue to follow our rule that if the movie came out 30 years ago, we're allowed to give away the ending, right?
Yeah, I think so. I think Speed. I think what's fair. I think Speed is fair game.
And finally, it was the finale on this day, 2007, 17 years ago, of The Sopranos on HBO, Jill, with the music of Journey, Don't Stop Believin', blaring.
Speaking of endings, Moshe.
Don't stop believing in another podcast.
Thank you all for listening to the Mo.news podcast. If you like what you hear, share this with your friends. It will help us grow. Please follow us and subscribe so you don't miss an episode, and review us in the App Store.
And head over to mo.news/free trial to join Mo News Premium. Jill, people can join the thousands who get their weekend news coverage on our Instagram account, news quizzes, access to our premium podcast. We have a new one out about campaign disinformation and election misinformation this fall on the premium pod. So give Mo News Premium a chance as a way to support what we're doing over at mo.news/free trial. You can check it out for free for 2 weeks.
All right. Bye, everybody.
Later.